Wow. Hey, is anybody else amazed by what we just saw happen up here this morning? Like, we just had high school students baptizing high school students, and then Anna, who was up here singing, she's actually a junior at Round Rock High School, which is incredible, and she's amazingly talented. And then Jackson and Klein, who are just up here, are 16 and 15, respectively. I don't know what you were doing at 15 years old. For me, I was just trying to find somebody's homework to copy. It's ridiculous. It is so cool to see. So proud of them. And it's so fun for me personally. I love what I get to do, to get to work with students, to get to be a small part of what's happening with students. I was realizing as I was preparing for this message that if you don't have kids in that age group, or maybe if you're new here to North Point, that might be an entire part of North Point, an entire part of our church that you don't get a window into very often. Because we have hundreds of students that are a part of our church every single Sunday between Transit, which is our middle school environment, and we meet right through this wall in the garage, our student space at 9:30 and 11, and we'll be in all three services when we go to three services on June 3rd. And then Inside Out meets right here on Sunday afternoons at 4:30. We take out all these chairs, we set up a completely different environment. It's just incredible, and it's amazing to see the momentum and what is happening with students. And for me personally, I love getting to be a part of wrapping up this series in particular, because this series, the approach we've kind of taken in this series, is very much in line with the approach that we take with engaging and leading students. Because the question that we've been asking every single week in this series is this. We've been asking, are there things we can do now to prepare for what's next? You see, on Sunday mornings with adults, we talk probably, half and half, a little bit about the future and what could be and what might be, but also the past, trying to unpack the past and unpack what has happened and make sense of things that have happened. But in student world, we're still in that 0 to 18 range, so we're still very much preparing for what is to come. And we said in each week that every single one of us are either in the middle of right now, or we're on the verge of, on the cusp of a new stage. We're on the verge of something next. For example, it could be any one of these for you. For me personally, at least scientifically, Emily and I are entering a new stage of our marriage, because the honeymoon stage, according to doctors, goes about 2 years. And we've been married like 2 years and 4 months now. And so we're just entering a new stage in our relationship, which is interesting to me because I came across that in preparing for this message. And I was like, that's interesting. Because like in college, you couldn't even see my floor, for example. I was crazy, messy, stuff all over the place. Then I got married, and it was like I developed a superpower overnight. It was like magic. Everything was clean all the time. It was perfect. And then like very recently, in like the sweetest way possible, she's so kind about it, but very recently, Emily's been starting to ask these questions like, hey babe, is that where your dirty clothes go? Is that where we leave our boxers? Those kinds of things. And I'm like, and I'm having these realizations. So we're entering into a new stage for us, which I'm excited about. We also very practically yesterday literally packed our bags because we take a trip each year pre-Camp 75 because of all that Camp 75 takes and consumes. So we go to kind of get ready for it. And we packed our bags yesterday. We're excited for the trip coming up. And Camp 75 season is something that requires a lot of energy for the two of us. It is hard to articulate for me how life-giving it is to get to be a small part of this. This is last year's boot camp. But at the same time, it is hard to articulate how confident I am that I am going to die younger as a result of being in charge of 300 middle school and high school students. I actually developed my first gray patch when I was 20, and I couldn't put a picture on the screen because it didn't translate, but when I was 20 years old, and it was the summer that I was a Camp 75 director for the first time. And so I attribute it to that. I attribute it specifically to a night where I had to have a conversation with a middle school boy, and I get it, it's not his world, but I had to try to kind of logically explain to him why mattresses don't belong on the roof of your cabin, like why that doesn't totally make sense, and I think that's where it started and, all those kinds of things. But I love getting to be a part of this. It's incredible. And as we think about the end of this series, I think talking about the next generation is incredibly relevant, because what we've been talking about up to this point is we've been talking about what is it that we can put in our bag, what habit can we start, or what habit can we stop? What should we be prioritizing in order to prepare for the stage that's coming, in order to set ourselves up to win in the next stage of life? What is it that we can do? What can we put in here? But as we conclude today, what I'd like to suggest is that every single one of us at some point or another, we are going to pick up our bag and we're going to hand it off to somebody coming behind us. Every single one of us, whether accidentally or on purpose, we're gonna hand a bag off, whether it's professionally, and we're gonna hand it to somebody that's coming up behind us into our role or our position. If it's with our families, perhaps it's our kids, that at some point, everything you've invested in, everything you've built, your story or your legacy is going to impact those coming after you. And so today I'd like to talk about what we want that story to be. I'd like to talk about what we want to be remembered for, what we want our legacy to be, what we want our final bag to look like. The way I want to phrase the question is this. I want to ask, what bag do you want to hand off to the next generation? How do we want to set them up? And if you're wondering, do I have to be passionate about kids and students for this conversation to be relevant to me? I would say no, because I think we can define the next generation as really anyone coming after you. So if you're a great grandparent, then a grandparent is a stage behind you, and you have insight that can help them in their current stage. Today, we have about 6 generations alive. Some sociologists would argue there's 7. They would say Gen Alpha is coming after Gen Z, and they started to be born around 2015. And so these are the generations that we have alive today. I want to focus our time a little bit on millennials and mostly on Gen Z. For me personally, I tried really hard to find a study that put Gen Z starting in 93, because that's when I was born, because I really wanted to be a part of Gen Z, but unfortunately I couldn't escape it. Millennials, basically the cutoff is if you were old enough to remember 9/11, then you are a millennial. And the reason that I wanted to escape being a millennial, is because of our reputation, which, as you guys know, you guys are aware with millennials, they're known as just being remarkably humble, selfless, self-aware. We're realistic. We know that we can't change the world in a week. We know that it takes at least 2 or 3, right? So we in reality, as Simon Sinek says, these are the lists that millennials are actually known for. In the workplace, they're tough to manage. The big word for millennials is entitled, narcissistic, self-interested, unfocused, lazy. Lucky us for those of us that fall into this category or this generation, that this is what we get labeled with. There's actually an organization called the Center for Generational Kinetics, and this is where a lot of the research comes from that I'm going to talk about today with millennials and Gen Z. They actually said there's 2 kind of branches of millennials, and that the people that are most offended or angry by entitled millennials, the group that is most offended by that is actually other millennials that are not entitled. We're angry about, what's being painted about us, those kinds of things. But the reason that I wanted to start talking about millennials is because I want to clarify that they are not Gen Z. They are not the generation that's coming after. If you kind of like just grossly put like all together like kids these days or students these days into those same kind of category of what we think about millennials, that they're entitled, they're self-centered or whatever, then this is a really important conversation for us to have, because research would say this is a very different generation. And I would like to argue that Gen Z should be important to every single one of us. You don't have to necessarily like or want to spend your time around children or students in order for Gen Z to be important to you. For example, about 2 weeks from today, based on when your specific college, graduates, about 2 weeks from today, Gen Z is going to graduate and enter the workforce for the very first time. They are our future. They've arrived and they're here. They're also going to push up culture and habits and their influence on us more than any other generation has. For example, grandparents today are on Facebook, right? Millennials pushed that up. Gen Z is going to push up trends and habits and behaviors more than any generation before them ever has. If you're the parent of a 22-year-old and younger, then these are your children. So this is the future. I think it's an important conversation for us to have, to know who they are. And research would say they are very different. They are a unique generation. For example, research would say that they are realistic, not in a sarcastic way, but they grew up their childhood in a recession. They grew up seeing terrorism on the news every single day. They don't have a sunshine and rainbows view of the world. They're more realistic than their millennial predecessors. As a result, they also have an independent work ethic. They believe as the world gets more globalized and more competitive and information and everything changes so quickly, they feel like they need to work really, really, really hard to stay ahead of the game and to have a competitive advantage. They're what we would call digital natives, okay? Millennials are digital pioneers. So millennials are known to be tech savvy, good with technology. We can use 2 screens at the same time. Gen Z can use 5 at the same time, right? They grew up with, in fact, the youngest of the Gen Z kind of generation, actually, and you know this if you have young kids, they learned to operate a smartphone before they could speak. Right? They can get to the camera, they can get to your photos, they can get to their favorite game before they can even tell you that's what they want. It's fascinating. This is the world that they've known and grown up in. As a result, they actually really value face-to-face communication and authentic relationships because they have to try to imagine a world where technology did not exist, and it fascinates them. They have a deeper appreciation for connection in relationships than millennials before them. They also are on-demand learners. So they are more likely to go to Google for all of their random questions than they are mom and dad, which is gonna make them one of the most informed generations that's ever lived. Gen Z also are global citizens, meaning millennials were online and connected and aware of the world around them, but Gen Z, the globe is catching up in terms of their ability to communicate with each other, so they're more connected to the globe, and they're the most diverse generation ever. So one TED Talk where the researchers said that Gen Z is only aware of diversity when it's absent in a room, which is completely opposite of the generations that preceded them. Gen Z is self-aware in a way that millennials are not because of the world that they've grown up in, because of the realistic view they have, because of how connected they are. They also are labeled as difference makers. One Stanford professor said that her students would rather spend 20 hours starting a nonprofit to address the issue and the cause of homelessness than they would want to spend 20 hours serving the homeless. They said they want to eradicate it altogether. They want to attack systematically root issues, which is kind of fascinating. There's a lot of potential in this generation. These are all amazing things and very different from millennials, but it is also true that Gen Z is the most depressed and anxious generation that has ever lived, or that we've known of since we've been tracking it. The average high schooler today has the same level of anxiety as a psychiatric patient in the 1950s. We don't know exactly why yet. A lot of it we think is connected to technology, that there is this desire for connected, meaningful relationships, but they don't have the opportunities or the social skills necessarily developed to actually engage in those, and it leaves a void and a gap. There's incredible comparison as well, so there's reasons for that, but they are the most depressed and anxious generation. So this is who is coming. This is Generation Z. This is the next generation. This is our future, and they're gonna influence us. So my question is, what bag do we wanna hand them? How do we want to set them up? And if I could, I'd like to give us a little bit of framework, a little bit kind of a context for our conversation moving forward, because my assumption, my thought is that a lot of us, whether we think about it or not, a lot of us live our lives as if when we think about the future, when we think about someday, when we think about maybe our last bag, our goal is to provide for the next generation, especially our kids, a standard of living. That's kind of our approach, whether we think about it that way or not. When you think about retirement, when you think about one of your final bags someday, we think about a lot of things that we can consume or acquire. We hope that, we have a certain amount of money by then. We hope that we live in a certain kind of house, a certain kind of car, that we might be able to pay for our kids, college education, that we can leave them with a certain amount. Maybe you want to provide the same standard of living that you had or a better one than you had when you were a kid. And none of those are bad inspirations, so don't hear me like shaming you for those things or anything like that. But a lot of us, that's kind of our natural instinct or inclination, is that we think it is our responsibility to provide a standard of living and that the next generation should be grateful for that. But I'd like to suggest perhaps the greatest gift we could give the next generation is not a standard of living. Maybe instead it's a standard for living. that they could look to you and watch you and get from you an example of how to have those deep, meaningful relationships that they so desire, how to connect with one another. That they could see you and you are an example of a great man or a great woman, that they see your character and learn from that, that your standard for living that you present to them may actually be the greatest gift that you could impart to the next generation. If you're in the room and you'd call yourself a Christian, I would almost say it's not optional for you. It's almost a command for you to care about the next generation, the children and the students that are coming after us. It's almost a necessity because of the person of Jesus. When you look at Jesus' life, it's fascinating, but I think we could objectively say, even if you're not a Christian, that perhaps nobody outside of Jesus has passed on a greater bag to the next generation. That when you talk about a legacy, when you talk about leaving influence, when you talk about making a multi-generational impact, I mean, this guy did it better than anybody. 2,000 years later, there are 2 billion people that profess the name of Jesus. He did a great job at handing off his bag to the generation coming after him. And he modeled it and he talked about it as well. For example, I think this is a fascinating question for us to think about. When you think about the ministry of Jesus, the 3-year ministry of Jesus, I think this is an amazing question. What did Jesus spend more time doing during his 3-year ministry than anything else? If time was perhaps his most valuable resource, what did he spend more time doing than anything else? I think it's debatable. I think you could argue it. I think there might be multiple things that come to our head. Was it prayer? Was it, serving the poor? Was it, just more general loving people? Was it preaching? What was it? To me, as I go through the Gospels, as I go through the documents of Jesus' life, to me, what stands out the most, maybe you'd come to the same conclusion, is that Jesus spent more time empowering the next generation than anything else. Not just teaching them or investing in them for them to get smarter, but giving them legitimate responsibility to go and love people. See, his ministry started with him getting baptized. And then the next thing he did was he went to his disciples, he went and recruited his disciples, and he said, come and follow me and all these kinds of things. And he had 12 disciples, his kind of inner group, his inner guys, and at least 11 of the 12, in all likelihood, were teenagers. He could have gone to the wealthiest in society, he could have gone to the most educated, he could have gone to the most respected, the most accomplished, but instead, he went and he got a bunch of teenagers. Maybe all 12. Peter was married. That doesn't mean he wasn't a teenager, but he might have been a little older. But at least 11 of the 12 that he recruited were teenagers. And we get insight into an amazing conversation that he's having with these very teenagers, with these guys, because they ask him a very millennial type question. And when they ask this millennial type question, in Jesus' response, you see the way that Jesus views the next generation. So here's the question that they asked Jesus. It says, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, who then is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? This isn't like an intellectual question for them. This is like, these are a bunch of testosterone-driven young dudes, and they're like fighting for Jesus' attention and crawling over one another, and they want to be the most important. They want to be number one. And they ask, who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Now, Jesus in this moment, he could have pointed to some Old Testament characters. He could have talked about Abraham or Moses or David or a prophet or whoever he wanted to. He could have talked about somebody like that. He could have pointed to the religious leaders of the day. He could have talked about himself. He could have given some example. But he looks at these teenage guys, and to answer their question, he pulls over the only generation younger than them. And he answers them this way. He called a little child to him, and he placed the child among them. And he said, truly I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever takes the lowly position of this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. This is a fascinating verse. And whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. He pulls a little child over and he's talking to these teenage dudes. And he's like, you want to know what it looks like to be great? He pulls the kid over and he says, it looks like this. It looks like this child. It looks like their humility. It looks like their trust. And when you welcome this child, when you welcome the next generation, it is the equivalent of welcoming God in a body. It is the equivalent of welcoming me, when you welcome, when you care for, when you love, when you equip, when you encourage one of these children? That is a powerful answer that they were certainly not expecting. He says, see that you do not despise one of these little ones. For I tell you that their angels in heaven always see the face of my Father in heaven. Do not despise them, meaning don't look down on them. Don't belittle them. Don't roll your eyes at the kids of these days. Take some responsibility for raising them, right? Like, it's not these kids these days and this is the end and all this kind of stuff. He's like, don't look down on them. Don't look down on them. He says, what do you think? What do you think? He tells a story. He creates common ground. The whole group would have understood this. He said, if a man owns 100 sheep and one of them wanders away, will he not leave the 99 on the hills and go look for the one that wandered off? And they're like, sure. They're not along. They're agreeing. There's no pushback to that. And then this is what happens when he finds it. If he finds it, truly I tell you, he is happier about the one sheep than about the 99 that did not wander off. This makes God happy when we welcome the next generation. This should make us happy and fulfilled when we welcome the next generation. He says, in the same way, your Father in heaven is not willing that any of these little ones should perish. He cares about every single child, every single student created in his image. And 2 chapters later in the same book, he continues this conversation. They bring it up again, and I think he gives even a more clear and straightforward answer to the question of what does it mean to be great. And they continue this conversation with the disciples, and he called them together, and Jesus said, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them, which means you've seen people abuse a position of power or authority for control or for their own benefit. But he says, not so with you. Instead, guys, listen up. Instead, come here. Whoever wants to become great amongst you must be your servant. And whoever wants to be first must be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. He spoke about it, and then he lived it out, and he said, look at my example, and he provided for them a standard for living. He didn't provide for them really a great standard of living, but he provided a standard for living. And he gave them a very straightforward answer, which he doesn't do all that often. He said, if you want to be great, if you wonder what it looks like to be great, to leave a bag of influence, for your story to matter, to leave a legacy, to make a mark on the generation coming after you, serve. It's that simple. If you want to be first, you need to be last. You need to follow my example. In other words, if you want to leave or you want to hand off a great bag, you want people to say like, wow, look at what was in their story. Look at what they did. Look at what they're, remembered for. What an incredible legacy. What an incredible man. What an incredible woman. If you want to hand off a great bag that you can be proud of, that is fulfilling, he says, in order to do that, you have to empty it. You cannot be focused on what you're going to put in it all the time and consume. And hopefully once I put enough stuff and I get enough money and I get the house or, maybe I get the body that I always wanted, I'm the version of myself that I always envisioned, all of those things. He said, look, if you focus on that alone, if you only pack your bag for you, right? As long as your bag is packed for you, you will never be happy. This is a big deal. This is enormous, and I don't want to skip this because of the fact that my concern and my worry would be you hear something like this, and your takeaway is like, I need to do the right thing, or this is a good thing to do, or this is helpful for young people. I should think about this more. I get what Jesus is saying, like, be a good person. It is more than that. You can't just decide, I'm busy, and I'm going to skip this, and I don't have time for this, or that's not for me, and still at the end of the day, be happy and fulfilled. He's saying this is a principle that you cannot escape. There is this odd kind of paradox here where in order for you to be full, you have to empty yourself. You have to plan, you have to have a strategy to empty you. And in so doing, you will actually find that you are fulfilled because you will have peace with yourself. You'll have peace with the relationships that matter most to you. You will have peace with your Heavenly Father. And that is where happiness, that is where fulfillment is found. You cannot consume or acquire your way to happiness. If your plan is to just fill your bag, to only provide a standard of living, to only chase your own hopes and dreams and goals, and your end game is not to make somebody else's life better, if you don't have a plan or a strategy to empty yourself for somebody else, then you will feel empty at the end of the day. Because every single one of you has something to bring to the table. Even if you don't like your story, you could be a good, bad example. That you still have something to help. If you like your story, all those kinds of things, whatever your story is, you have the opportunity to impact the generation coming after you. So how do we do that? I think our next question is, how do we welcome the next generation? If when we welcome that child, if when we welcome students, it is like welcoming the person of Jesus, how do we do that here? I want to take you through like a 60-second crash course small group leader training. If you were a small group leader here at North Point, from Wamba all the way up to Inside Out, we talk about something called our 5 essentials. There are 5 strategies to engage and to lead and to equip and to empower the next generation. One of these strategies in particular, I think is our application today. I think it's what we all could take away and apply and start to incorporate. But I want to show you all of them real quick because this is what we talk about all the time. We talk about creating a safe place. We say all the time that if there's a conversation that students are unwilling to have here, they will go have it somewhere else. So this has to be the safest place in the world to have any conversation, to ask any kind of question. They have to feel like they belong here, like this is a home, like they can belong perhaps even before they believe. We have to partner with parents because we don't have any weird false, illusion or anything like that. We know that the parents always have been and always will be the most influential figure in that child's life. And they will be long after our small group leaders don't have influence in their life anymore. So we have to partner with and equip parents. We have to make it personal. We tell our leaders all the time that when you are authentic in your faith, that translates to the next generation, and we have to move them out. We have to move them to what's next. We have to know we're not the last adult to ever influence the next generation. So whether it's Wamba to Upstreet, Upstreet to Transit, Transit to Inside Out, or Inside Out to college, we have to be preparing them for what's next. But the first one, I think, is perhaps our application here today, and that's to be present. The kind of simple, sticky way that we say this is we say all the time that you have to show up. Challenge our leaders constantly. What does it mean to be a small group leader? It means to show up, specifically to show up. Mentally, regardless of whatever distractions are going on, I'm engaged, I'm here, I'm intentional to show up predictably and to show up randomly. Show up predictably every Sunday that a student can trust that you will be there and you may be the only predictable, consistent influence in that child's life. And to show up randomly for the big moments and the low moments. To show up for the graduation, to show up for the breakup, to bring them coffee on the day of finals, to show that you value and care for the next generation. And I think if you're in here and you are a child, meaning you've ever had parents, or perhaps if you are a parent, I think you already know intuitively how powerful this very simple idea is of showing up because of somebody that showed up for you, or maybe perhaps because of somebody that didn't show up, that you wish would have shown up, and the impact that had on you. But this is incredibly powerful. I called my dad this week, and I told him I wanted to share this story because this story is, I think, I have to go with my second favorite memory of my childhood. The first, I think, is when my brother was born. I remember holding Jeremy. I think that's probably number 1, but number 2 is this memory. And I called my dad because I wanted to get the details right. And it was when I was living in Cleveland, Ohio. I was in elementary school, and my dad and I were in this organization called Indian Guides, it's kind of like Boy Scouts or something, but it's this father-son organization, and we would do all of these cool things all the time with a bunch of my friends. And one of my favorite parts of the year was this annual winter retreat. And so we would go, and it was awesome because we'd all play pranks on each other, and there were all these really cool father-son traditions, and I just lived for it. Like genuine, in elementary school, it was my favorite weekend of the entire year. And there was one year where my dad was flying in from a work trip on a Friday, and he was supposed to basically get me from school about 4 or 5 o'clock, and we were supposed to drive a couple hours to this camp. But we were living in Cleveland, and it was the winter, and there was a snowstorm, and he was snowed in New Jersey. And they flew him from Jersey to Buffalo, which I don't even know, it doesn't totally make sense, but he went there and he was stranded there. And then I was talking to him on the phone, and it's already like 7, 8 o'clock, And I'm realizing this weekend might not be a reality. And I'm in tears on the phone. And he's in tears on the other side, thinking that he missed this big moment because of a work trip and he's feeling so bad about it. He finally gets home at nearly midnight. And he thinks, he's 15 minutes away from bed. But he comes in and I'm sitting there with a coffee for him and some hot chocolate for me. And I'm like, let's do this. And he goes and he packs his bag and we get in the car and he drives me 2 hours to this camp. And we get there, and the tradition that I missed was the father-son sledding down this giant hill. Everybody's already asleep. Everybody's already in the cabin. And at 2:30 in the morning, after he spent the entire day in an airport, my dad goes sledding with me 1,000,000 times down this gigantic hill. And it was maybe my favorite moment or memory of my childhood. And I called him this week because I said, Dad, I need to get the details of this right. Because I don't know if you know how big of a deal that was to me, but when I think about that moment, the way I remember it now, the way it's grown over time, I remember it like you were stranded in the mountains of Nepal and you built an airplane, crash landed in Lake Erie, swam 50 miles, picked me up and carried me on your back to the camp. That's what it felt like to me. That's what the experience was like. And what he did was he showed up. And I know he's given me all kinds of great advice and things, but I didn't believe it when I was young. And there were cool Christmas gifts and birthday gifts, even though now I don't remember what half of them were. But the memory of him just showing up, of being there, communicated more to me about how he viewed me, how he loved me, how it was unconditional, how he was there for me than anything else he could have possibly done. I think about our small group leaders. Our favorite celebrations are the moments where we see our small group leaders show up in just extraordinary, surprising kind of ways. Last year, we had a freshman girl who lost one of her best friends. One of her best friends passed away. And that's hard at any age. It doesn't matter how old you are. But for a 15-year-old girl, it's nearly impossible to process, impossible to understand why. And she was so confused, and she was so angry. And she met with one of her small group leaders. And her small group leader could tell, a couple of minutes into the interaction, how angry she was, how unprocessed the emotion and raw the emotion was. And she said, we're not going to talk about this right now. This is not going to be helpful. And the small group leader takes that 15-year-old girl to her house that they were staging and trying to sell. And so it's clean and everything's packed and put away and all these things. She gets out one of the packed up boxes of dishes. They go onto the back patio. And she hands her a dish and she says, just throw this at the wall as hard as you can. And they proceed to break the entire box of dishes on the wall in the back patio that they're staging is supposed to look nice and clean. Then she says, let's pick up the scraps, and they pick up all the little pieces, and they break all the little pieces until they're both crying and in each other's arms, and she looks at her and she just says, I need you to know it's okay to be angry. It's okay to be confused, and it's okay to hurt right now. The mom of that freshman girl was in our office the next day, and she was in tears describing the story to us. And she said, I feel like I got to talk to my daughter again for the first time in months this morning. And your small group leaders did something in her life that I just never could in a million years as her mother. And I cannot describe how grateful I am. Those are the stories where we're like, that is why we do what we do. That is why this is so significant. I would imagine that based on the fact that you're here in the room, that maybe somebody showed up for you. Have you thought about who showed up for you? Why you're in the chair that you're in right now? I know for me personally, it took an army to show up for me. I mean, it was my small group leader and years and years and years of free food, not for him, but for me, and just all the conversations I had with him. I think about 10 years of Buck, that's our lead pastor, his investment in my life, showing up in the high moments and the lowest of moments for me. I think about my first week of Camp 75, and I think about that was my first time in church in years, was that year. I hadn't been in church in about 10 years. I wasn't a Christian. The Camp 75 experience was how I placed my trust in Christ. And we had a driver that drove our team of 6 or 7 students around that was just awesome. And then we had all of these host homes that we went to. And then there were adults here serving us food. And every single one of them, just by their presence, was communicating to me and was communicating to my friends that we mattered, that they believed in us, that we weren't just little kids in their mind, but they believed we were going to do something significant and had the capability to do something significant. I wonder who showed up for you. Or have you thought about, perhaps, what would showing up look like for you? You see, my fear or my concern is that we would hear something like this and we would walk away with good intentions and we'd be like, yeah, that makes sense, like that's good. But then we would get busy and, then we would go on to, whatever is next. And I think there's things we could talk about. Like I think we could talk about, man, is there a neighbor in your neighborhood who maybe is in the stage of life right behind you and you could help them out, you could invest in them, you could care for them? Is there a coworker that maybe is gonna have your position in the future that you could invest in, that you could care for? I think those things are good. I just worry maybe we would forget about those and get busy. For a lot of us, what this has to look like is it has to look systematic. We've got to make sure that there is a way that we are consistently emptying our bag for the benefit of the next generation. Maybe for you, that looks like considering actually being a part of, on a regular basis, one of our family ministry environments. Wambaland and Upstreet are our kids' environments, Transit is our middle school environment, and Inside Out is our high school environment. Did you know that nationally, statistically, 50% of students that were engaged in church in high school will walk away their freshman year of college? About 50% or so will come back, but decades later. The greatest predictor of if they will stay is if they had 5 or more consistent adult presences in their life in the 0 to 18 years that pointed them to their faith. Those hardly ever walk away from church. I get the question a lot, do you guys need help? Do you guys need small group leaders in any of these environments? I'm like, well, look, here's the thing. We've identified that there is a specific ratio. It's about 1 to 8, one small group leader for every 8 students that we can engage. It's hardly ever much less than that, and it's hardly ever much more. Meaning we can only engage about 8 times the number of students we have small group leaders to love and to lead them. There's about 15,000 high school students alone in our area. So yes, we're gonna need like 3,000 high school leaders to create a safe place for every single one of them. Yes, we're always looking for more leaders. It doesn't matter how great everything is from stage or how fun the environment is or how great the communication is. At the end of the day, we cannot engage them unless we have a small group leader for them. So maybe that's what it looks like. You've been on the verge of, do I get engaged or do I get involved or, do I consider this or even reach out to learn more? I don't have any kind of agenda with this, but just to make it practical, you can go to our website, mpaustin.com/serve. You can learn about all of our environments there. You can request more information there. It's on our app too. There's a spot called Get Involved on our North Point app. That's not what the app looks like though. It's cleaner than that. We'll see if it gets up there. But there's a little block that's about getting involved, and you can go to the same forum and same place and same kind of location. My hope for all of us, maybe that's not for you, that's not your thing, that's okay. There it is, see the Get Involved block. Maybe that's not your thing, and that's okay. But the way that we do this the best at North Point, kind of the highlight of our year, what it looks like for us to empty our bag for the next generation, what it looks like for us to show up in our community, what it looks like for us to show up for students and for our students to show up and love and lead and serve well, is the highlight of our year, and it's what we call every summer here, Camp 75. And Camp 75 season is officially here. It's composed in 2 main parts. And the first one where our students show up in masses is boot camp. And this was last year's boot camp. We had 330 students at boot camp last year. This year we had over 200 sign up in the first 2 weeks. I have no idea what's gonna happen or how many are gonna go or if I'm just gonna hide that whole week or what that's gonna look like. But it's incredible. If you think about 300, 400 students being a part of this, I mean, that's not like a small, like cute little thing. That's like, we could make a legitimate impact in our community. Because what these students are doing this week, they're having a blast, they're having the best week of their year, they're building incredible relationships, they're growing with their small groups and with their small group leaders. But at the same time, we're investing in them and training them to go and lead and love and serve our community for a week in July, which is called Camp 75. And the reason we call it Camp 75 is because these students will be broken up into like 80 teams of 5 or 6 students, and they will go and lead these 75-minute camps all over our area that look like this. It's basically like taking Wambaland and Upstreet mobile. It's bringing it to a front yard or a backyard near you because it can be difficult for somebody to show up in church that hasn't showed up in church in a long time. That can be a really big, really scary barrier. But a lot of times it is much more accessible to walk over to your neighbor's front or backyard that you already know, that you already have a relationship with. Last year, we had about 70 locations all over our area. And this year, I mean, we are quite literally gonna need like hundreds of host homes. It is crazy to think about. Hosting looks like opening up your front or backyard for one of these and having the opportunity to just engage in and care for your neighbors. Nothing that we do at North Point has more stories of life change. Half of our baptism videos point to Camp 75 as the origin of their life change, how they got connected for the very first time. This is the week of Camp 75. Not only are students doing this, but we also partner with all kinds of nonprofits in our area to where they may lead 2 of these camps in the evening, but in the morning they may go serve somewhere in our area, in our community. Because we've realized as it's grown, wow, it's gaining momentum, it's gaining influence. We want to legitimately show up in our community. We want to love our community well. We want our community to be grateful that we exist. We want to show up for them. We want to show up for the next generation. It is remarkable to think about what could be possible this summer. Now, that's Camp 75. The 2 greatest ways for all of us to be a part of Camp 75 is exactly what you saw on there. It's hosting and what we call driving. The reason I love Camp 75 so much is it's cross-generational. It brings all the generations together. There's something significant for a 3-year-old to do, and there's something significant for a 95-year-old to do. The whole stretch, there's something significant that you can show up and be a part of. And this kind of cross-generational magic is, I think, what brings so much of the life and the momentum to Camp 75, because it's exactly what we're talking about today. It's generations upon generations handing off their bag to the next generation. Hosting looks like what I said, picking a 75-minute time slot in the morning or the evening for 4 days, that week, July 9th through the 12th, and offering up your front or backyard, inviting your neighbors to be a part, and letting one of our teams come and lead one of those 75-minute camps in your yard. A lot of times I get the question, how can I find one of these camps near me? And my first question back is, well, you know what? If you have young kids, maybe you should just have one in your yard. And you should invite your friends to come with you, and then there's your location, and it's the easiest, most convenient one. We also need people to drive them around. And if we don't have enough drivers for them, they quite literally will come to this building and have nowhere to go. When you show up and drive, I mean, you're doing the practical of getting to them location or where they're going to serve, but then as well, your physical presence of showing up shows that what they're doing matters to you. It shows that you care about what they're doing. It empowers them just by being present. And our students are showing up. 400 students is insane. That is crazy. And our adults have to show up for that to continue. It's flipped of where it is most places, but our students are showing up, which means we've got to have our adults show up and empower the next generation, empty our bag for the next generation. So here's how I want to end our time in kind of our last minute here. I want to make this as simple as possible. I know you've got to go pick up kids. I know you've got something next, all those kinds of things. So I actually just want to give you a tool to make sure you have it at least in your hand before you walk out of here today. And it's a tool that is going to give some more information about what Camp 75 is and even give you the opportunity to host and drive if you would like to, or get more information if you would like to, because host, home, and driver registration actually opened today. It launched this morning. So nobody signed up yet. Nobody is behind yet and all those kinds of things. So our guest services volunteers are going to come down. They're going to hand out those cards to you. I'll explain what's on it, and then we'll head out of here together. On this card, there's opportunity to request more information, opportunity to sign up. And I'll just be honest with you. Do I want you to be a part of Camp 75 because I'm passionate about the next generation, because of the impact that Camp 75 had in my life? Yes, I'm excited about what's possible. Do I want you to be a part of Camp 75 because we need about half of this church to host or drive because of the amount of students that we have, literally every other chair? Yes. Do I want you to recruit more people to host and drive? Yes, absolutely. But I don't just want you to do it, though it's great, just for the next generation. I want you to do it because I want you to be proud of the bag that you're handing off as well. Because I want your bag to feel full even when it's empty. Because I want you to have the opportunity to do exactly that, to follow the words of Jesus, that when he said, when you welcome one of these children, you are welcoming me. So let's do that. Let's show up for, let's empower, let's lead, let's love well the next generation together. I'd love to pray for our time as we head out of here this morning. Heavenly Father, God, thank you that you first showed up. God, you sent your son to us. That's what Jesus did, as he walked amongst us and held us and loved us and ate with us and laughed with us and cried with us. And God, I just really ask that you would move in our hearts. Give us the ability, give us the strength, that this is not about the person next to me or the person in the aisle in front of me. God, this is about us individually, that you're calling us to show up, to invest in, to empower, to love well, to lead well, the responsibility that you've given us to love and lead our community well, God. And we are just so excited to see what you're going to do as a result of so many people saying yes this summer. God, I can't wait to see what's in store. We love you big. We need you big. It's in Jesus' name that we pray. Amen. You guys can drop these in the basket on your way out. You can sit there and fill them out if you'd like. I'd love to invite you for a new series next week. Thanks, y'all.